And now with the next stimulating talk by Matthias, Michel.
Okay. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Okay.
This is an audio test.
Okay, that works. All right, so in recent years, I guess we've all seen headlines like these. There's growing evidence that insects feel pain just like us. These are sentients. There's ample evidence that fish feel pain. Insects may feel pain, so it's growing evidence. Further evidence that crabs and other crustaceans feel pain. More recently, there was this declaration on animal consciousness in New York that prompted a few headlines, such as a group of prominent scientists believes fruit flies, fish, and mollusks might experience pain and pleasure. More recently, there was, well, slightly before that, there was this report that led to an amendment in the UK law regarding cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans as sentient. Okay, so now, of course, the important word here is evidence. Okay, we are told that there is evidence in favor of these claims. So you might wonder, what is this evidence that apparently keeps growing? Okay, how could we know whether crabs, worms, or bees have feelings? Well, the main method for answering those questions is the so-called markers methodology. So you're going to determine which animals are conscious and which animals are not by determining whether animals can perform functions that we think require consciousness. So there are two steps. Step one, find functions that you think require consciousness. And step two, determine whether animals can perform those functions. If they can perform those functions, you say conscious. Right. That's animal sentience research for you. So the question obviously now is, well, but which functions require consciousness then? Okay, so I've compiled the list that I called the list. Here's the list of functions that require consciousness according to animal sentience research. Are you ready for the list? Trace conditioning, integrating information across sensory modalities, self-recognition and mirror, flexible planning, instrumental learning, responding to analgesics, making motivational trade-offs, the ability to engage in play, episodic memory, flexible self-protection, source memory, remembering which places are linked to noxious stimuli, rapid reversal learning, self-administering analgesics, metacognition, and so forth. Okay, so this is not an exhaustive list. I would take it that most animal sentience researchers would nod along to the list. Others will maybe scratch a few items. Maybe they'll add a few other items to the list. But anyway, this is the list. Now, the question is, where is the list coming from? Where is the list coming from? Why these functions instead of any other functions? So I've been in this consciousness business for some time, and I can tell you, please trust me, that there is no scientific evidence that these functions are associated with consciousness. It's just intuition. Okay, so take, for example, responding to analgesics. There's no scientific evidence showing that you couldn't do that with unconscious nociception, that is, the unconscious detection of body damage or of tissue damage. Okay, there's no evidence that you need consciousness. We just have this spontaneous intuition that an animal that's not conscious wouldn't go around popping painkillers. Okay, it's just a spontaneous intuition. There's another. For these other functions, it's a kind of VIP club of functions that have been validated by experiments. So that's the VIP club of empirically validated functions. Now, I'm about to argue that we have no reason to accept anything like the list. Okay? No reason to accept anything like the list. First of all, I'm going to argue that our spontaneous intuitions about what consciousness does are guided by fallacious reasoning. And second, I'm going to suggest that most of the empirical evidence that we have is actually driven by a severe experimental confound. So my conclusion will be that current evidence of sentience is deeply, deeply unreliable, and all of animal sentience research is actually built on sand. All right, so let's start here. Here's an intuitive, spontaneous thought you might have. I can perform many functions while having conscious experience, and therefore my conscious experiences must be relevant for performing those functions. So that thought illustrates what I call the consciousness-only fallacy. is the fallacy of thinking that just because a conscious state correlates with a function, that consciousness is therefore relevant for that function. So let me illustrate why this is a fallacy. So suppose that you reach with your hand in order to grasp an object. Okay? The spontaneous intuition that you might have is that your conscious state is guiding your hand as it goes. Okay? That if you consciously see the object moving 1 inch to the left, you're going to adjust, right? And it's really your conscious visual state that's driving your head. Now, there's good evidence that this is actually wrong, okay? As some of you might know, based on work on the so-called two visual streams hypothesis. So a cool example of this is the hollow face illusion. So in the hollow face illusion, you can make a convex face appear concave and vice versa, okay? Now, clearly, you see the illusion consciously. And what Melgoodale and colleagues did is that they built a 3D model of this illusion, okay? And they put targets on those. So it's a 3D model with targets. They then asked people to draw the position of the target. Obviously, you can see in the case of the illusion, they're going to draw a convex target as if it were placed on a convex face, when it is in fact placed on a concave face. Is it? No, vice versa. Okay, you get the point. But now, the other condition is what happens when you ask people to flick the targets off of the faces and there's no illusion anymore. Okay, so the illusion is trumping your eyes, but not your hands. Okay. So that suggests that there's conscious perception that represents the concave face as convex, and there's a non-conscious visual stream that represents, namely vision for action, that represents the concave face as concave. Okay, so two incompatible representations, one of which is conscious, the other one is unconscious. So again, you might have the spontaneous thought that since conscious vision correlates with online action guidance, conscious vision is functionally relevant for online action guidance, but that's not the case, okay? Thinking that would be committing the consciousness only fallacy, the fallacy of thinking that just because a conscious state correlates with a function, therefore consciousness is functionally relevant for that function. Here's another intuitive thought you might have. Suppose we establish that some conscious experiences are relevant for performing some functions. Okay? You might think my conscious states seem to be involved in the performance of many functions, therefore consciousness itself must be required for performing those functions. Here's a second fallacy. There's another trap here, which is what I call the consciousness first fallacy. It's the fallacy of concluding that a function must require consciousness just because a conscious state is relevant for performing that function. So that's a little bit more subtle than the other fallacy. So let me explain. So here's a good old working memory task. So you're presented with two Gabor patches, and then each of those Gabor patches is masked, and then you have to report the orientation of one of those two. Okay. So as you're doing this, you presumably have the feeling of maintaining a mental image of one of those two in your mind. Okay. So assume for the sake of argument, that it is in virtue of consciously maintaining a mental image that you solve the task. Suppose that's true. Does that mean that working memory maintenance requires conscious as opposed to unconscious mental imagery? In other words, just from the fact that you do this with a conscious state, does that mean that consciousness is required for this kind of task? Okay, that's the question. So there's reason to doubt this. First of all, what you find is that performance on this task is very much independent of the vividness people report for their visual imagery. Even people with aphantasia can do this just perfectly fine. Furthermore, if you decode the visual representations from visual cortex, you're going to find that you can decode the information equally well from people who report no visual imagery whatsoever and people who do report conscious visual imagery. Okay? So that suggests that people with aphantasia do encode the information in visual cortex. They do have unconscious visual mental imagery. Now, I think this is just one of many cases illustrating possible unconscious working memory maintenance. My point here is not to review this literature, this is a bit complicated. Instead, I just want to use that to illustrate the fact that a conscious state being relevant for a function, so my conscious mental imagery being relevant for maintaining the mental image, does not imply that the function requires consciousness, okay? Just because you do something with conscious states does not imply that the function requires consciousness. So that's the consciousness first fallacy. So the upshot is that if it seems intuitively obvious to you that an animal wouldn't be able to perform some function if it were not conscious, think twice, okay? Think twice. We still don't have a good idea of what the unconscious can do. We don't know what we can do unconsciously, and we don't know what requires consciousness. Instead, what you have to ask for is empirical evidence, okay? Not just intuitions about what consciousness supposedly does. Right, so let's look for the empirical evidence now. Let's look at the empirical evidence. So how are we going to find the functions associated with consciousness? Well, the main method is to compare conscious perception and unconscious perception, and then you see what you can do only in the conscious conditions and what you cannot do unless the stimuli are conscious. So to do that, you're going to use various suppression methods or consciousness suppression methods like visual masking or binocular flash suppression. In binocular flash suppression, it's a bit like binocular rivalry on steroids. Okay? So there's a very vivid pattern in one eye, in the other eye, there's a stimulus. Okay? And of course, since this pattern is so salient, you're not going to see this one consciously. So you can compare instances of conscious and unconscious perception. The functions that are relatively unaffected by whether perception is conscious or unconscious are not associated with consciousness, and the functions that only work in the conscious condition are going to be deemed associated with consciousness. Okay, so that's the basic idea, very simple. Now, this methodology has been used in many, many studies. Here I'm going to simply focus on instrumental conditioning. So here are some pigeons is being instrumentally conditioned to play ping pong. Okay, so they are rewarded for making a shot. In the background, you can see hear very, very faintly Skinner's voice. Okay, this was actually done by Skinner. So that's a cool example. The question is, does it require consciousness? Could you do that without being conscious of the balls? Okay. Now, many people think that there is very good empirical evidence that instrumental conditioning does require consciousness, and this has now made its way into animal sentience research. So, for example, in the report I was talking about earlier, they rely quite heavily on instrumental conditioning, and they write that instrumental learning is among the functions that seem to have a particularly strong link to sentience. Right? So is that true? So the example we are going to talk about now is a study in which they wanted to see if you can learn the association between seeing a certain stimulus and pressing a button unconsciously. Okay? So they want you to see the stimulus unconsciously and then press a button. Can you do that unconsciously? Here's the experiment. Suppose that we want you to learn the association between seeing a symmetric stimulus and pressing a button. Here's how it works. The target is going to be presented sandwiched between those two masks. Okay? And the target can be either symmetric or asymmetric. Now, what you're going to do in order to make the target conscious or unconscious is that you're going to vary the time, how long the target is presented between the masks. Okay? If it's presented for a long time, you're going to see it every time. If it's very, very short, like 15 milliseconds or something, you're almost never going to see it consciously. Yeah? After this, you're going to decide whether to press a bar or not. And then, if you press the bar, you're going to get a reward if the stimulus was symmetric, and you're going to be punished if the stimulus was asymmetric. Okay, you're going to either get some money or lose some money. Of course, the participants are not conscious of the stimuli if everything goes well. Okay, So they have to decide whether to press the bar or not. To them, it's going to feel kind of random at times. All right, so can you learn to press the bar when you see the stimulus as, when you see only the symmetric stimulus and not press the bar when you see the asymmetric stimulus? Oh, of course, they also had a discrimination test. That's a very, very important point. How do we know whether they see the stimuli consciously or unconsciously? Well, they had this discrimination test where they asked people to discriminate whether the stimulus was symmetric or asymmetric. And they decided that we're going to say it's unconscious only if you had chance for determining whether the stimulus was symmetric or asymmetric. Okay? So people are at chance in the unconscious condition. That's going to be very important. In the unconscious condition, people are at chance for saying whether the stimulus is symmetric or asymmetric. So again, the question, can subjects learn to press the bar when they see the stimulus, the symmetrical stimulus, even if they do not see it consciously? So here, this is plotting the proportion of correct responses across time. And what they mean by a correct response is press the bar when it's symmetric, don't press the bar when it's asymmetric. So you can see that increases. People can learn based on what they consciously see. That's not a very important discovery so far. Here's the discovery now. What you find is that when people are not conscious of the stimuli, they cannot learn the association at all. Okay? They cannot learn the association between symmetrical stimulus. Oh, I'm going to get a reward, I should press the button. Okay? So they conclude based on that, that instrumental conditioning requires consciousness. So this is really the reason why people say that instrumental conditioning is a function associated with consciousness. Okay? You can't do it without being conscious of the stimulus, and that's then used as evidence for consciousness in non-human animals. If you can do instrumental conditioning, then you're more likely to be conscious than not. So does this show really that consciousness is required for instrumental conditioning? My answer is no. No. Why? Because there is a trivial alternative explanation. There is a trivial alternative explanation. Here it is. In one condition, you can discriminate between symmetric and asymmetric. In the other condition, you can't discriminate between symmetric and asymmetric. So the conclusion is that you can't learn based on visual targets, you can't discriminate, which is totally unsurprising. Okay? How am I supposed to associate a target with a stimulus if I can't discriminate what the target is? This is totally unsurprising. This has nothing to do with consciousness. It's just if you want to learn based on a target, you need to see the target. Here, there's no perception of the target and therefore no learning. This is just totally unsurprising. Now, we have two possible explanations. First explanation is that instrumental conditioning requires consciousness. This is not a trivial explanation. And there's the other explanation, my explanation, which is that instrumental conditioning requires correctly seeing the cues on the basis of which one is supposed to learn, which is again a trivial explanation. Since it's trivial, it's better. Okay, it's just the best explanation. Now, I think this worry generalizes to nearly all experiments studying which functions are associated with consciousness. In the field, unconscious perception is almost always achieved by decreasing discrimination capacities to the point that visual states become basically non-functional. Okay, you decrease the strength of the signal to the point that people can't do anything with it. Now, as a result, almost all of the experiments showing that unconscious perception is ineffective for some tasks or some functions are therefore totally unsurprising. Okay, it's totally unsurprising. Why? Because it's by making them non-functional that you made it unconscious. Okay? It's by making the stimulus non-functional that you make it unconscious. Therefore, don't be surprised when people can't do much with unconscious stimuli. You made it that way. So here's another way to look at it. Here's the standard for research in consciousness science, for research on the functions of consciousness. So you're going to create a condition in which you see the stimulus clearly. Okay? You're going to be 75% correct. Then you're going to create a second condition where signal processing associated with the stimulus is severely degraded. And then shocking news. There are things you can do when you see the stimulus clearly that you can't do when signal processing is severely degraded. This is sarcastic, by the way. This is not shocking news. My point is that investigating the functions of normal seeing is not the same as investigating the functions of consciousness. Okay. Here, what we're investigating is what you can do when you see the stimulus clearly. Okay. Unsurprisingly, there are things you can do when you see the stimulus clearly that you cannot do when you don't see the stimulus clearly. And this has nothing to do with consciousness in particular. So unequal discrimination capacities between the conscious and unconscious conditions is a confounding factor. Okay? So if you pick any given function from the list, chances are that empirical results do not show that the function requires consciousness. Most of the time, like 99% of the studies, show simply that subjects cannot perform a function when the stimuli are indiscriminable, when the signal is very, very bad, okay, or very poorly discriminable. Now, I'm going to address two objections. The first is this one. Matthias, you're just begging the question. You're just begging the question. Why? Because discriminability and consciousness are the same thing. So you can't say that discriminability is a confounding factor. The second one is, Matthias, you're just asking for an unreasonably high standard of evidence. This is just the best we can do, and so we have to go with that. So I'm going to address those two objections, starting with this one. So you might think that I'm begging the question because consciousness might itself be systematically related to discriminability. And so discriminability is not a confounding factor. Now, I'm going to be very clear. I am not begging the question. Okay? If you think I'm begging the question, you're begging the question. Why? Because discriminability can vary independently of consciousness. There is evidence for that. There is no evidence to the contrary. Okay. So that means that studying which functions require high discriminability is not the same as studying which functions require consciousness. So let me give you some evidence. First case is an obvious case, is the case of blind sight. So blind sight is the presence of visual abilities in the absence of reported visual experience, which is observed in patients with lesions to the primary visual cortex at the back of the head, V1. So a wide variety of visual abilities are preserved in blind sight. They can discriminate shape, movements, and colors. They can reach and grasp targets. They can identify facial expressions in their blind visual field, and that when they do so, that will trigger basic emotional responses. So for example, if you show them an angry face, they'll deny seeing it, but you can see that their heart rate will increase. Okay? They can attend on the basis of, they can attend to visual stimuli they deny seeing, and they can learn on the basis of visual stimuli they deny seeing. So in this video, for instance, blindsight patient GY, who was studied by Larry Weisskranz, is moving his arm to mimic the movement of a dot in his blind visual field. Okay, so he's going to tell you that he doesn't see the dot. Here's the interview.
All right. Graham, can you tell me what sort of experience you had that made you move your arm?
I just know something's moving over in the right field.
Can you describe it?
No, it's just I know there's some movement there.
And what did you actually see?
I didn't see anything.
Okay, so what did you actually see? I didn't see anything. Now, here are a few examples of dissociations between reported consciousness and discriminability in blind sight. So in this study, for example, patient GY had to tell whether a stimulus was moving up or right. Okay? And here, this is plotting his reported awareness as a function of stimulus contrast. And you can see that as his reported awareness goes down, as the contrast of the stimulus decreases, his performance stays pretty much the same. Okay? So that's a big, big dissociation between reported awareness and performance on the task. Here's another cool example, comparing first choice detection for a stimulus that is either a first order stimulus or a second order stimulus defined by texture. First one is defined by luminance, the other one is defined by texture. You can see on this plot that GY is performing basically the same for the two kinds of stimuli. Okay, just as good at detecting the stimuli, either first order or second order. But his reported awareness, depending on the modulation of the contrast, is quite different for first order and second order stimuli. This is even better in this case. So if you manipulate the spatial frequency of the stimuli, his reported awareness for the second order stimuli will always be 0. Okay? He'll never report being aware of the stimuli. But his reported awareness of the stimulus will decrease with increasing spatial frequency. But if you look at his performance stays the same. His detection performance stays the same for both kinds of stimuli. Okay? So again, that's a very, very strong dissociation between the capacity to discriminate and reported awareness. Now, if you don't like blindsight for some reason, here's another case of dissociation of consciousness and discriminability in healthy subjects this time. So this is the attentional blink. In the attentional blink, what's going to happen if two targets presented in a stream are presented between, let's say, 200 and 300 milliseconds of each other, what's going to happen is that if you see the first target, if you detect the first target, you're going to miss the second one. Okay? So a typical attentional blink effect looks like this. So if you see the first target, your capacity to detect the second target, if it's presented 300 milliseconds later, so at lag 3, for example, here, is going to decrease. Now, there's this very, very interesting phenomenon of lag 1 sparing, which is that if the two targets are presented directly in succession, so first target, second target immediately with nothing in between, you're going to be able to report the identity of the second target as if, just as well as if there's no attentional blink at all. So the attentional blink curve does this, okay? At lag 1, when it's presented right after the first target, you're going to consciously you're going to identify it. Now, this experiment had this fantastic design where they just add also for visibility ratings. Very complicated. And they made this big discovery, which is that lag 1 sparing spares discriminability but not subjective visibility. Okay. Lag 1 sparing spares discriminability but not subjective visibility. People are just as good at lag 1. People are much better at discriminating the identity of the stimulus at lag 1 compared to lag 3, but visibility of the stimulus is the same at lag 1 and lag 3. If you don't lack visibility ratings, there's the same result with confidence ratings. It's even clearer here. You get the same reported level of confidence for lag 1 and 2, but the performance looks nothing like this. So that's another dissociation. All right, so there would be many, many more. Okay. The point is, I'm not begging the question. Studying which functions require high discriminability is not the same as studying which functions require consciousness, and therefore, nearly all studies claiming to identify functions associated with consciousness simply show that some functions can't be performed based on indiscriminable stimuli, which is again trivial. Okay? Trivial conclusion, and we don't learn anything about consciousness. Okay. First objection. Let me now turn to the second objection. How much time do I have? Okay, perfect. So, second objection, I'm just being too difficult. I'm being too picky. No, I'm not being too difficult. We can study which functions require consciousness and not just high discriminability. We can do that with at least two methods. The first one is match performance methods, and the second one is dissociation paradigms. Okay, so I'm going to present those two methods with blindsight patients because those are the clearest cases. But it's also possible to adapt those methods in neurotypical people. Okay. So the experiment I'm interested in here was carried out by Navindra Perso and colleagues at Hak Wan Lao's lab a few years ago, well, 2011 now. So with, again, patient GY, you've met him already. So he has a unilateral lesion on the left, So the reports being blind for stimuli presented on the right, reports not being aware of those stimuli. So in this case, GY's task was to say whether the vertical grating was up or down. If it's up, it's like this. If it's down, it's like this. And then after each tile, they had the question, did you see it? Or was your response just a pure guess? Yeah. And the important thing in this study is that they varied the contrast of the stimulus. So they wanted to make it as difficult to discriminate the stimulus in the sighted visual field and the blind visual field. So they do the exact same task in both visual fields. Okay? And what they do is they match discriminability between the two visual fields. Okay, so that's discriminability. This is percent correct. Unfortunately, this is not D prime, which is what the purists would want. Yeah.
How did they measure it?
What?
How did they measure it?
How did they measure it?
How did they measure the different?
Just titrating the contrast. Yeah.
Okay, so it's still different.
Yeah, the stimulus is different. The important point is that the internal signal associated with the stimulus is going to be the same. Because if it were different, you'd be able to use that, or at least the discriminability, the signal, the dimension that they use for discriminability is going to be the same. Yeah. So it's matched discriminability. Obviously, GY is not reporting seeing the stimuli in the sighted visual field, in the blind visual field, but reports seeing the stimuli in the blind visual field. Oh my God, jet lag. GY reports not seeing the stimuli in the blind visual field, but he reports seeing the stimuli in the sighted visual field, although interestingly, it's still pretty conservative, even in the sighted visual field. Now, with that, we can investigate which functions are associated with consciousness independently of this discrimination confound, okay? Because now we can match the discriminability of the stimulus in the conscious and unconscious conditions. So what they try to do is investigate whether metacognition, the capacity to think about your own responses, is associated with consciousness. And the way they did that is that they asked GY, would you be ready to bet some money on your responses? Okay. So if consciousness facilitates metacognition, or if metacognition is associated with consciousness, what we should find is that the rate of advantageous bets is going to be higher in the normal field compared to the blind field. Here, an advantageous bet is betting on your response when you're right, not betting on your response when you're wrong. Okay. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you'll lose money. Okay. So somewhat surprisingly, GY is willing to bet on his responses in the blind visual field. Okay. You might think, that's weird. Why does he do that? Well, here's the answer. He knows he has blind sight. Okay. He's been told his responses in the blind visual field can be as high as 90% correct. So suppose you know that, you could bet with your eyes closed if you know that your performance is going to be good anyway. Okay. Now, here's the important thing. The important thing is not the overall level of bets. We don't care about that. What we care about is the proportion of advantageous bets, namely bet when you're right, don't bet when you're wrong. And if you compare this proportion of advantageous bets in the blind and sighted visual field, you see that you could make money off of GY, basically. Okay? If you bet with him on his performance in the blind visual field, you can make money off of him. He's going to bet even when he's wrong. All right? So the proportion of advantageous bets is much lower in the blind compared to the sighted visual field. So this result suggests that metacognition is a function facilitated by consciousness, or maybe it requires consciousness even. And note that I'm using this case to show that there is a way of controlling for the confound of discriminability between the two conditions. Okay, I'm not asking for something that's impossible. I'm asking for something that's been done and therefore is possible because it exists. Now, the other case I'm going to discuss are dissociation paradigms. So here's an example of what I mean, again, with patient GY, studied by Navindra Perso and Alan Coe. So they asked GY to tell whether a stimulus was, so it was presented in the normal or blind field, in the upper or lower quadrants of the screen, okay? Here it's up, Here it's in the lower quadrant. Now, GY can do this perfectly fine both in the sighted visual field and in the blind visual field. Now, again, to manipulate the difficulty of the task, they increase the contrast or decrease the contrast of the stimulus, such that sometimes it was barely visible. Right, so that's easy again. GY can do this, no problem. Now, here's the trick. They had another version of this task, which is an exclusion task. Instead of asking GY where the stimulus is, they asked him, where is the stimulus not? Upper quadrant or lower quadrant? Here, the correct answer is lower quadrant. GY is not dumb. He can do that in his sighted visual field. Okay? So it's lower quadrant. But here's the thing. He cannot do this in the blind visual field. It's not just that he's at chance. He is worse than chance. Okay? He's worse than chance. Why? Because it systematically answers with the actual position of the target, not where the target is not. And what's more is that now you increase the contrast, you make the stimulus more visible. It should be more visible. Does it get better? No, it gets worse. Okay? You increase the stimulus, the contrast of the stimulus, it gets worse, not better. Okay? So we have a dissociation between increasing the strength of the stimulus between the sighted visual field and the blind visual field. In the sighted visual field, he gets better, like everyone would. In the blind visual field, he gets worse. Okay, he gets worse than chance. Could he learn to do that? That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I don't know. In principle, I know that contrary to what people say in reports on animal sentience, you can have instrumental conditioning in blind sight for stimuli that are apparently invisible, but that's only done in blind sight monkeys by.
Seeing something, when they see something and being aware of something, you could learn it's evidence to be aware.
Yeah. Well, not really, because it could be learning based on an unconscious stimulus. If you want, here's a cool study doing instrumental learning in blind sight monkeys. So they had this task. That's an experiment that actually is that will count in my question time. That's not part of the talk. Where they had the monkeys saccade, so make an eye movement to a particular area of the screen, which was called a hidden area because there was nothing in it. But the task was to learn to make a saccade towards a particular area on the screen when there was a target, a cue, sorry. So the cue was either presented in the blind visual field or the sighted visual field. So what you would do if you were trying to search for the area is that you would move your eyes like this, and when the cue appears, you'll fixate. So you'll learn where the target is. Okay. Now, blind sight monkeys can do this even if the cue is unconscious. Right? And here's the cool thing. If you found something you're looking for, you stop looking for it, usually. In the blind field, what happens is that the trial starts, they saccade right on target, they wait there for a second, and then their eye movements keep looking for the hidden area, even though they've already found it. Which seems to indicate that they have no awareness of the fact that the cue was presented, okay, and that they indeed had found the target. Right. Okay. So that's just a case of unconscious instrumental conditioning. That's slightly different from those other things. Okay. So again, going back to this, the point is that we get a dissociation between increasing the discriminability or the signal strength or stimulus strength of the stimulus on consciousness and performance. Okay. So here's my conclusion. I think that we should not accept the list, unsurprisingly, given what I said. First, our spontaneous intuitions about what consciousness does, intuitive reasoning on the matter, those things are quite unreliable. I think we are biased in various ways. For one thing, we just don't know what the unconscious does because it's unavailable to introspection. Okay? So we have a kind of survivorship bias. The only thing we can see are instances of conscious execution of functions, we are just totally introspectively blind to when those functions are performed unconsciously. Secondly, I think 99% of the empirical studies claiming that some functions are associated with consciousness are confounded. Okay, they just show that there are things you can do when you see the stimuli clearly that you cannot do when you don't see anything. Okay, that's not surprising. It's just like learning. You can't do much with your eyes closed. It's basically, I'm exaggerating, but that's basically it. But I think we can do better. Okay, good news. We can do better by developing performance matching methods, or by using those dissociations I was talking about. All right, so that's it.
Very much for the energetic talk. Because I have the microphone and exit maybe I missed it, but you are always using the word consciousness. It's stimulus awareness that you want to point out. Is it like a consciousness? I use the word consciousness instead of just content of consciousness to be more specific, or that is awareness of a particular stimulus. So it's like consciousness.
Well, it's consciousness of stimuli, which, if you want, can be understood as subjective awareness of stimuli. I mean, I don't like the term awareness as a synonym for consciousness, because I think you can be unconsciously aware of something. So, for example, suppose I'm just sitting in a park and I feel like someone's looking at me. And presumably it's due to the fact that from the corner of my eye, I unconsciously detected someone looking at me. In that sense, I might be unconsciously aware, visually aware that someone was looking at me, and then I look, and indeed the person was indeed looking at me. So it's just, maybe it's just a quirk. I think it's better to keep the term consciousness for the subjectively experienced stuff. Yeah.
You first.
What do you take the implications for panel ethics to be what we work?
I think it should be more okay to say that we don't really know, instead of claiming that we have evidence or that the evidence is strong when we don't know what the evidence is. For animal ethics, I think we should still use, how do you call it? Not a presumption of innocence, but no, not benefit of the doubt. But anyway, we should think that we should treat animals as conscious until we have better evidence, because it's probably the best we can do. There's a fairly high probability that I'm wrong. And certainly we shouldn't confuse the fact that we don't have evidence for the fact that we have evidence that they're not conscious. Okay. It's just we should be clear about how strong the evidence is, because if it turns out that we make false promises based on evidence that is not that strong, that's going to make us look like clowns, and people will not listen to us the next time.
Thank you very much. Will be a generalizing kind of question. So you were talking the previous operationalization of consciousness, which is the decision making based on the ability to discriminate between two different stimulus. You provided a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. And I wanted to ask you what would be the new operationalization of consciousness that you would suggest based on all the different experiments that you told us about, where you can make discrimination of different stimulus without conscious awareness. What would consciousness be here?
Yeah, what kind of indicator can we use other than discrimination? I think the best way to do it is just to start in humans, right? Who can report about their conscious experiences. And then once we identify functions that seem to require consciousness in humans, we can bootstrap our way to better measures. So for example, if we can find instances of metacognition in non-human animals, you can then use that in order to measure conscious awareness. In the full case, you can actually have rats bet on what they saw. Here's how you do it. Here's Megan Peters had this cool experiment where the rats would see a gabber patch, and the contrast was kind of, it could vary, would be a difficult task. And then what the rat had to do is either initiate the next trial directly or wait and then either get a reward if the rat got it right or no reward if the rat got it wrong. Okay? So you're essentially betting your time. If you think you're wrong, you should initiate the trial, or if you think you're 50-50, you should initiate the trial, the next trial directly, so that maximizes your number of rewards overall. And by doing that, what they did is that they showed that you can reproduce signatures of confidence that we find in humans. That's a cool set of experiments showing that in principle you can have animals bet. Yeah.
Don't have too much time for more questions, but a few.
Thank you. So I have a brief objection that relates to that question. So I'm pretty worried about the criteria. This is somewhat of a leading question, but since I know you're involved in this work, I really like these two IMC criteria and three paradigms.
Yeah.
And in those conditions, it seems like awareness or betting perfectly follows, and even in an ideal Bayesian observer, with objective past performance. And so I wonder whether there's kind of a watered down version of the question begging objection, which is that in some sense it's all just signal propagation and gating. It's just that we can stop it at multiple levels. And so we're going to be studying gating at the level of V1 versus at the level of inferential cortex. Why should we privilege one over the other?
Well, in one case, it's pretty. So here's a case where we can show that there is significant unconscious processing. What this guy does. Okay. So if in that particular case, there's an extended period of unconscious processing before you get consciousness. Even in the cases of 2IFC tasks, so two intervals forced choice tasks, the problem of the criterion is this for those who don't know. If I ask you whether you saw the stimulus, and it's very, very unclear whether you saw it or not, most people, most of the time, will say they didn't see anything. Okay, namely, they have a biased response criterion. It's a bit like if I ask you whether you speak French, maybe most of you know a few words, but you all say no. Okay, maybe you don't count just knowing I love you in French as speaking French. So you'll have a conservative criterion for answering, do you speak French or not? It's a bit like the same thing here. So people, even if they see stuff, sometimes they'll tell you they didn't see anything. Now, the smart way of avoiding this problem is to have two intervals, one in which the stimulus is present, one in which it's not present, and then you ask a comparative question, in which one of those two was the stimulus more visible? Now, if it's unconscious, it should be as visible when it's present as when it's not present. Okay? And that's not a biased question because we're asking you for a comparative question. When you do that, in most experiments, people find no evidence of unconscious perception. I mean, there is evidence from David Soto showing that there is unconscious perception of ensemble properties. I have an experiment with Axel Clermont and Pietro Amario where we found some evidence of unconscious perception in Vernier discrimination, but it's weak evidence. In the case of blindsight, I think there is decisive evidence showing that it's not a criterion problem. Why? Because blindsight, the main signature, is characterized by the violation of an equality that you find in everyone for discrimination tasks, which is posited by signal detection theory, which is that your performance for discriminating between two intervals in a detection task should be your performance on a single interval multiplied by the square root of 2. I mean, it's a mathematical relation between the two. And if you correct, one of those tasks is not biased. Okay? So you can estimate what d prime in the normal task, the single interval task, would have been had the subject not been biased. And what you show is that they're still much, much lower than what they would have been had they not been biased. Okay. So that's the study by Azzopardi and Cowie that really convinced a lot of people that blind sight is not just response bias. It's a bit technical, I'm sorry. we can talk about it later.
Does the same criticism apply to consciousness in artificial systems? And I'm interested in particular the relationship between metacognition and consciousness. So is that the consciousness is necessary for metacognition? Is metacognition necessary or sufficient for consciousness?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that this markers methodology is good for non-human animals, but it doesn't work for AI systems. Why? Because of the gaming problem. The gaming problem is that for any function, you can just optimize the system to perform it, even if it's not conscious. Okay. So, identifying functions associated with consciousness is not going to tell us much. However, I do think that metacognition is, or at least some kind of metacognition is necessary for consciousness, because I think that if you have a state, you're in a mental state, and you're totally unaware of being in that state. So suppose I see something red, and I'm totally unaware of seeing something red, then I'm not seeing red consciously. So if that's the case, that means that some kind of metacognition, my awareness of being in that state is required for being conscious of the red stuff out there. And therefore, metacognition is required, a necessary condition for consciousness. That's an a priori argument, but I think the evidence also goes that way, right? So it's good when those two line up, philosophy and science together.
So sorry, we can take more questions. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy the ethical premise set up. In the case of the blind side, even if the example showed that the subject responds by saying he just feels like there was movement, so it felt like something reportedly. And I know that Nicholas Humphrey has been dealing with blind side, comes up with a kind of like state, varieties of consciousness worth wanting. And you could take this to be not such a binary question, that you either are or you're not. There are some forms of consciousness that we care about, and some we don't. So on the ethical.
Oh, so on the ethical thing, I think there are some forms of consciousness we don't care about, definitely. So I don't think consciousness is intrinsically valuable. I think consciousness enables experiences that are valuable. So for example, if you have a creature that's just devoid of any conscious experiences, and just all its life, all it experiences is a dim light or something boring, a Gabor patch, right? That's not valuable. That's not more valuable than no consciousness at all to me. So on the question of dimensions of consciousness and kinds of consciousness, I think there's only one kind of consciousness, and it's zero-dimensional. That consciousness is all or none, because I really don't really understand what it means to have a little bit of consciousness. If you have a little bit of consciousness, there's something it's like for you to be you, and therefore you're conscious, full stop. Now, what is multidimensional are the contents of consciousness, namely the stuff you can be conscious of. I can be conscious, that's infinite dimensional. Right? I can be conscious of all sorts of things, but being conscious of all sorts of things is not thereby being more conscious, right? Just like being conscious of a dim light is not being dimly conscious. Right? So it's really consciousness is on or off, and then the contents of consciousness can vary in degrees. That's the picture I have in mind. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the great discussion. Usually I love to stick to time schedules very strictly, but that's actually fun. I love to like all the time. But we have a cover, and after the coffee break, we come back at 3:15, so we still have half an hour. Outside there's coffee for you, and I'm looking forward to that session. Thank you again.
It's full line. Yeah. It's Nice.